Well, if they'd rather die, they'd better do it.
And decrease the surplus population.
If they'd rather die, they'd better do it and decrease the surplus population.
If they would rather die, they'd better do it and decrease the surplus population.
Now I keep hearing that there's so many versions of A Christmas Carol, but if you stick to straightforward feature adaptations, there's not so many. Silent versions deserve their own video, so talkies, and I'm sticking with English. With those limitations, there are surprisingly few over 40 years, and then things went a little weird starting in the 70s, with straight live-action adaptations replaced by musicals, parodies, animations, filmed stage productions, or a combination of those. The closest to a normal cinematic adaptation, which is also arguably the best of those, involves Muppets, so not that normal. You have to go to television to find regular adaptations, with both George C. Scott and Patrick Stewart trying their Scrooges. But I want to stick with theatrical releases. Besides, if I'm going to talk about my favorite TV version of A Christmas Carol, it's going to be Doctor Who and Blackadder. So that narrows it to 3. The earliest of these is Scrooge, produced at England's Twickenham Studios. Its selling point, beyond being the first talking version, was Seymour Hicks, who'd played Scrooge thousands of times over many years on stage, and even appeared in a 1913 silent version. Time has been rough on this one, particularly as it fell out of copyright, so no one bothered to keep it in good shape. A somewhat restored version came out in 2002, but it's still pretty scratched. You can also find it cut to 58 minutes, obviously a terrible idea. And then that shortened version was colorized. I'll be sticking with the 2002 DVD. Next we have the 1938 version, actually named A Christmas Carol for a change. It's a reasonably budgeted MGM production. It was intended for Lionel Barrymore, who was renowned for playing Scrooge in an annual radio broadcast, but he dropped out due to health, which hit hard as he was the entire purpose of the film. But he suggested Reginald Owen to replace him, and on a tight schedule, the studio went with that. And the last is 1951's Scrooge. Alastair Sim was the first choice for the lead, and filming went smoothly. It did well enough in English theaters. In the US, where it was retitled A Christmas Carol, Radio City Music Hall decided not to run it at Christmas, thinking it wasn't light and breezy enough for kiddies. For a time, it lived in the shadow of the 1938 film, but around 30 years of TV broadcasts have swapped their reputations. And that's our 3. I'll refer to them by their years: 35, 38, and 51. There's little need for me to recite the plot of A Christmas Carol, nor would I dare expound on its meaning. So I'm jumping straight to saying how they compare to each other, as a whole and in parts. Starting with screenplay. Oh, in 1935, we've got problems. 79 minutes is just too short. To squeeze the story into that time, they cut almost all of Scrooge's past. No childhood trauma, no sister, no Fezziwig. The only thing Christmas Past shows Scrooge is his breakup with his fiancée, and then her later being happy with her husband. It's 5 minutes and then we're out, which not only destroys Scrooge's character development, but messes up the flow of the film. With so little there, other parts seem too long. Christmas Day with the Cratchits is set at a more normal pace, making it seem to last forever. And if time was an issue, then why show the Lord Mayor's banquet? Yes, it's mentioned in the book, but almost no adaptations touch it. Or a sequence of Scrooge going back with the boy to get the goose after the boy fails to wake the butcher. Neither is bad, and the banquet allows for some commentary, the lavishness of the rich versus the poor huddled at the gate. But it's not worth cutting Scrooge's past. At least most of the dialogue belongs to Dickens, but I think this is one of the worst scripts for any adaptation. 38 has a much better balance, though at 69 minutes, too many details are trimmed. The cuts include anything that MGM thought was too dark, so no wheeling ghosts, and no ignorance or want clinging to the ghost of Christmas present. And worse, the entire scene of the rogues selling off Scrooge's belongings is gone. Scrooge's fiancée is also excised from the picture, taking away a piece of Scrooge's development. There's 2 other notable changes from the norm. Fred's part is expanded, which I'll touch on later. And Scrooge fires Bob Cratchit, which is a pointless alteration. Also, I'd have traded the minute or so of the snowball fight which gets him fired for even a reduced scene of Scrooge's fiancée. At least the edits to Scrooge's past don't harm the flow of the film, as it feels that we're spending equal time with each of the ghosts, though that time is not enough for any. The alterations to the ending are not great. This time, Scrooge shows up at the Cratchits, killing our final joke. They were happy with their Christmas that the spirit took Scrooge to see, which now won't exist. And the timing of Fred's party and the Cratchits' dinner is confusing, with Scrooge doing both while the sun is still up. All in all, it's a major downgrade from the book. But of the screenplays, this is the one most accessible for young children, who will care less about the lost motivations and explanations. At an hour and a half, 51 isn't exactly long, but it's the only one that allows the story to breathe. The pace is much better. For a film over 20 minutes longer than 1938's, it reaches Marley's ghost 5 minutes earlier. A touch of narration gives us a better opening than others. If you've got Dickens' excellent lines, why not use them? Little is cut from the book. No Mayor's Banquet, but I think that's fine. The main changes from the source material are additions, not subtractions. Scrooge's development is examined in greater depth. I'll look at that more when I look at Scrooge, but I will say the additions help the story. Next, what about the production? I'm putting a lot in one category, but as what I really want to get to is character, I'll live with that. So for production, I'm talking art direction, costumes, music, cinematography, editing, and partially direction. And the 1935 version, again, doesn't do great here. The literal darkness fits with the figurative darkness, but I still need to see, and far too often it's too difficult to discern what's going on. And no, that's not due to the poor quality of the current prints. The New York Times review from 1935 states, it suffers from underlighting and occasional recording lapses. The sets are passable if a bit small, but the camera work is distractingly slight, with too few cuts. Is that the best angle for this scene? Repeatedly, we end up looking at the back of a head. This is 1935, not 1931, so there should be more of a recovery from the switch to sound than I see here. I'd say the artistry was there, but not the skill to pull it off. For 38, I've got no complaints with MGM production. It's clearly stage-bound, but those stages are elaborate and attractive, nicely lit, and competently filmed. If the camera work doesn't enhance, it doesn't take away. The music, by Franz Waxman, is pleasant and matches the emotions and scenes. This is what I'd call a workmanlike product of the studio system. Again, pleasant, if not brilliant. This is a bright, shiny, glimmery production. Christmassy, yes. Fitting for a ghost story, less so. For 51, it's as if someone started with the artistry from 35, but actually knew what they were doing. Yes, it's dark, but I can see everything I need to. It's beautiful, but off-putting. 38 said, it would be great to live in Dickensian London. 51 says quite the opposite. And like both of the others, the camera work isn't generally spectacular, but in this case, there are some shots which rise above. So, all of the skill of the 38, but with more purpose and more art. This is meant to be a ghost story, and of the three, only this one feels like it. If I was Hicks or Owens' Scrooge, I wouldn't be frightened when a ghost shows up. But here, in these sets, with this lighting and harsh music, I'd be petrified. So on to the characters, and as Scrooge is most important, by far, I'll save him for last. First, the ghosts. 35 is going to have some real problems in this category, as it barely includes the ghosts. Let's start with Marley. He's invisible. Only Scrooge can see him, not us. I've heard the excuse that it was the budget, but no, this wasn't a quota quickie. And you don't have to use special effects. Just some guy with makeup and chains would work. Almost anything would work better than nothing. The minimal special effects serve well in 38. This Marley looks good, and is the choice if you want a reasonable and non-threatening ghost. I can believe this is Marley, easily chatting with Scrooge. And Leo G. Carroll is a character actor that's always welcome. But what this Marley isn't is frightening. This is a guy, here to pass on some information. 51's Marley looks fine as well, translucent with chains. Michael Hordern, another character actor I'm always happy to see, and who would play Scrooge himself in a TV version, goes a very different way. No calmness here, more screams. Carroll's take on Marley's ghost was mostly human. Hordern's is mostly ghost. There's no subtlety here. It's way over the top. For a ghost, who is supposed to be unnerving and frightening, this works. As for the hordes of lamenting ghosts, well, they might be in 35, assuming they are invisible, or they might not. 38 skips them without question, leaving 51 as the default winner here. The effects are simple, but I find it effective. The Ghost of Christmas Past has the most variable look, as Dickens' description is impossible to film. It works fine in text, but filmmakers have to go their own way. 35 gives us an ominous, glowy humanoid apparition. As a design, this could work. The problem is, that's it. You've just seen all there is. A few seconds of a spirit is better than none at all, but not much better. And as Scrooge's past is so severely cut, there just isn't enough of a ghost to rate. 38 gives us a Christmas angel, minus the wings. It's hard to get more Christmassy than that, and it works for balance. A feminine Christmas to stand by the very masculine ghost of Christmas present. And it's a very traditional form, which seems fitting for Christmas past. This is my favorite version of this ghost in not only these three, but in all adaptations. 51 gives us an old guy. He's fine, the performance is good, and the concept does the job, and I'd certainly put him ahead of some of the later versions. But there's nothing special here. If I ask why is he an old guy in white robes, I don't come up with an interesting answer. The Ghost of Christmas Present is the easiest, conceptually. He's Father Christmas, and most versions present him at least well enough. How hard can it be to get a big, jolly, bearded guy in robes and what the hell 35? That is not jolly Christmas time. It's uncouth Christmas. I'm sensing chicken grease soaking into that robe. And why did he shave? His oddly timed speech doesn't help. 38's is more like it. He looks great. His voice properly deep, sometimes jolly, sometimes sarcastic, and sometimes stern. This is a top-tier Christmas present, though not perfect. He's a bit overly coiffed for my liking. I'd prefer a longer beard and less time with a curling iron. And once again, we're faced with the problem that his part has been cut. Without ignorance and want clinging to him, he loses his most dramatic speech. In 51, we have another top-tier Christmas present. He's got the same mix of jolly, sarcasm, and sternness. The look is perfect, at least in black and white. Avoid the colorized version where they make his robes red instead of green, and he gets his speech, mostly. He doesn't age, as the spirit does in the book, but none of these three do, and it isn't a major loss. There's less to tell one Ghost of Christmas yet to come from another. A silent cloaked figure with nothing visible but a hand. Keep it simple, and it will be good. 35 just keeps him as a shadow, and in theory, I like it, but the execution is less than exciting. And as the future segments are trimmed like most everything is, there's not a lot here. 38's is the standard. Later versions give us LED eyes or put him on a skateboard and surround him with special effects. None of that is a plus. Cloaked figure is all you need. His face is only partially visible for a second, which is a mistake. Why this isn't the best is because he's too physical. He seems to be a man with a black cloak, which isn't scary enough. Well, they didn't want scary, and they didn't get it. 51 plays it better, yet again. The figure is there, but rarely seen in whole. A hand and a robed arm. Other times a figure in the background. Less is more. It's more eerie. So 51 is where to go if you want scary ghosts. 38 works in a cheery, non-frightening way, and 35 barely competes. So how about the human side characters, by which I tend to mean Fred and the Cratchits, mainly Bob. In the book, Nephew Fred is unbreakably happy by nature. Scrooge also points out that he's poor enough, which is hard to imagine as in every film he seems to be living well. He's a man who should be happy due to his outlook. 35 presents a passable Fred, cheerful and wealthy. Like so many in this film, his screen time is trimmed a bit much. He's also a bit too energized. Sure, Fred is supposed to be enthusiastic, but this much energy would involve a good deal of white party powder as well. Fred's role is greatly increased in 1938. He starts the film, sliding on ice and chatting with the Cratchit boys. His marriage has been swapped for an engagement, for a touch of romance. And those changes do little harm to him, or the story, kinda. He's nearly a portal character, which is an interesting way to go. I do question him lacking the money to marry, considering his home. Just how much does he need? And his fiancée is a bit huffy. I don't like that Scrooge now comes to save Fred financially, instead of just joining him as family. Fred isn't supposed to want anything from Scrooge. And the extra time with Fred is not worth what was cut. But I can't blame Fred for that. They could have lengthened the film. He's a bit broad, like most things in this film, but I must admit that I once played Fred in my school days, and my interpretation was 10 times broader, which was easily 9 times too much. Having grown up with the 38 and 51 versions, watching them both every year for 20, maybe 30 years, I'm always surprised how little Fred is in 51. Since he's so much more present in 38, that's the one that gets in my head. 51's is more like the book. And that's not a bad thing. This Fred has all the enthusiasm, all the kindness, all the joy, dialed down to human levels. Of the 3 Freds, this is the one whose party I'd enjoy the most. I think that makes him serve the story best. As for Bob Cratchit and company, he's easy to make acceptable, but hard to make a real boon to a film. He's got to be obsequious, trot over, and bubbly. 35's Bob is generic. He hits all the beats and stands out neither negatively nor positively. He's a bit stagey, but then this is a stagey film. His family is mostly forgettable, which is a positive for me, as I'm never a fan of Tiny Tim, and this Tim doesn't bug me. Gene Lockhart, as 1938's Bob, often gets criticized for looking too well fed. I don't agree. Everyone who's poor doesn't need to be emaciated. His problem is that he's too much, too obsequious, or too crazed. He's in the broadest of the 3 versions, so everything is a bit much, but this Bob just goes too far. And yes, I did applaud the over-the-top performance of 51's Marley, but there was a point to that. What's the point here? An attempt at humor mostly, and the rest to pile on the sentiment. But neither works. It makes him a caricature instead of a character, making it hard to care about him. Lockhart's real-life wife, Kathleen, makes an acceptable Mrs. Cratchit. And their real-life daughter, June, is one of the lesser Cratchit children I never remember. She'd become much more famous as the mother in Lost in Space. The Cratchits as a whole are pulled down by the weirdest Tiny Tim. Getting a good performance from a child is always a trick.
I'd like to stroke it.
As with 35, 51's Bob Cratchit doesn't go for any big swings. Call him generic plus. He does exactly what he's supposed to do, and is more human than the others. I believe him when he's cheerful, and I believe his sorrow. There isn't anything conceptually about this Bob that sets him apart. He just does it better. Hermione Baddeley, who plays his wife, is another of those character actors I like to see, and she too does a great job without doing anything unusual. Add in a Tiny Tim that doesn't get under my skin, and this is a solid Cratchit household. Which brings me to the big one, Scrooge himself. A film succeeds or fails based on him. If he's great, I can let other problems slide. If he fails, then nothing else matters. And he's surprisingly hard to get right. What so many versions of this story get wrong is in making him act miserly because he's evil, instead of making him act evil because he's miserly. If he is foundationally evil, then why should we want him saved? If he's just nasty, I'm not going to care about him. Additionally, his transition isn't believable if it's from evil to good. There's got to be something more. He has to be at least partly correct. He needs to have a righteous fear or anger that drives him to be a miser and act as he does. Then he's not being remade, but corrected. And his change is believable as the spirits are working on his fear and anger, not his evil. So how do these do? I've got to give Seymour Hicks credit for not playing it safe. This is different. His Scrooge is a little goblin of a man. I always thought of Scrooge as fussy. Unhygienic never came to mind. I can almost smell him. A basic tenet of Scrooge is that he doesn't take advantage of his wealth and lives a Spartan life. But this is Scrooge as a diseased vagrant. He doesn't go out of his way to be mean, so that's good. And more importantly, he is a frightened person, which gives us an opening to his rehabilitation. But with his past cut, there isn't enough to tell us why he is what he is, nor to justify his change. Just bam, new personality. With more time, perhaps this could have worked well. Perhaps. Still, I think of Scrooge as money grubbing, not just grubby. Reginald Owen's Scrooge is just mean. There's no indication of fear underneath. He doesn't even show fear when he should. Marley's ghost's appearance is annoying to him, not frightening. And with the cuts to his past, we don't even see any reason for righteous anger. The only thing Christmas past shows him are happy memories. That leaves us a Scrooge I've no interest in seeing saved, and whose alteration comes out of nowhere. Yes, the short runtime is an issue, But I think they got Scrooge wrong on a basic level. Oh, and why does he walk like an anthropomorphic cricket? I'm guessing Owen is trying to do an old man walk, but had he never seen an elderly human? I don't think it will be a surprise to you that I consider the 51 Scrooge superb. That starts with Alastair Sim, one of the finest comic actors of all time, and he uses his comedy chops both as miserly Scrooge and as the one redeemed Scrooge who's actually funny. Sim plays it perfectly, and the script helps. This Scrooge isn't outwardly cruel. He's not trying to harm anyone, and you can see him getting, not entirely unreasonably, annoyed at people coming one after the other to bother him when he just wants to be left alone. And Sim lets us see the fear under it all. This is a Scrooge who's afraid of what the world could do to him, and quite reasonably so, considering what it has done to him. And here the added material really helps. The death of his sister is a powerful moment, both in showing us why Scrooge becomes Scrooge, and in the spirit showing Scrooge how he messed up. This is a moment that can fundamentally change a person. Normally, I don't worry much about the actors playing young Scrooge, but in this case, with the expanded storyline, I have to bring up George Cole, an actor I've enjoyed in many British comedies, almost as much as Sim himself. No, he doesn't look like Sim. It's rather curious they never seem to hire someone for young Scrooge that resembles the older actor, but he does have the proper intensity. The joy, the fear, the anger, it works. So this Scrooge would have made the 51 version a winner if nothing else worked, but everything else works. So putting it all together, what have we got? None of these films are bad. 1935's is interesting, and if this was the only version, I'd recommend it. But it's not. It's too short, it misses important elements, and considering its condition, I can't come up with a good reason to watch it when you could be watching a better version. 1938's fails in important ways, but it is an easy entrance into A Christmas Carol. When I was a kid, I didn't have a preference between this one and 51, and watched them both every year. By the time I was a teenager, yeah, I did have a preference, and it wasn't for this. It was made to be light and fluffy, so think of this as a good choice for little ones. And 1951's is nearly perfect. Leading man, supporting players, script, and the ideas behind it all are as good as it gets. And it's spooky. I don't think this is just the best of the three. This is the best version of A Christmas Carol ever.